We're examining the effect of radical reforms on societies and cultures in your world building. The French Revolution was a time of massive change in France. It started because ordinary people were fed up with unfair taxes, food shortages, and the king's absolute power. They wanted equality, liberty, and a say in how the country was run. Revolutionaries abolished feudal privileges, giving more rights to common people while ending the special powers of nobles in the church. They shook up the old system. No more kings ruling by divine right or nobles getting free land. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The revolution led to internal conflicts and resistance, like rural uprisings and even the Reign of Terror, where thousands were executed to protect the revolution from enemies. One of the revolution's biggest achievements in the end, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which declared that everyone is equal and has basic rights, ideas that influence democracy worldwide. These reforms were radical and dramatically changed French society. Studies have found that the radical reforms introduced during the French Revolution, like abolishing feudal privileges and guilds and promoting equality before the law, led to significant long-term economic benefits in the regions they controlled. When you think about how radical reforms can drive long-term change in your world building and in societies in your world, think about what kind of radical reforms could occur in your world and who would introduce them. How do these reforms disrupt the existing order? How are they justified by society, by the revolutionaries? What immediate effects do the reforms have on society? Do they bring chaos? Do they bring hope? Do they bring conflict? And to which sectors of society? How do these reforms affect different classes or factions in your world? Who benefits and who suffers? How do the reforms shape the society years later, 50 years later, 100 years later? Are they remembered positively? Are they remembered negatively? When we think about the French Revolution, France and areas that experienced French occupation and institutional reforms often saw faster urbanization and economic growth, despite those initial disruptions due to the chaos, the wars, the instability of the French Revolution. So when you think about economic growth through institutional change in your world, what kind of institutional reforms could trigger an economic boom in your world? Think legal, political, or economic systems that can be upended. How do these reforms encourage innovation, trade, or industry? What resources or technologies suddenly become more accessible as a result of the reforms? Do regions or cities benefit most from these reforms? Why? How does it affect neighboring areas? What happens to individuals or businesses who were already powerful before the reforms? Do they adapt? Do they resist? Do they fall? How does the new wealth created by the reforms change society, culture, politics? Looking again at the French Revolution, the reforms weakened local oligarchies and aristocratic privileges, which had previously hindered economic development, and they made those regions more open later to industrialization, to economic opportunities. So when you think in your own world building, in your own societies that you're constructing, how could reforms disrupt old power structures? Who holds the power in your world before the reforms? Is it the nobility, the religious leaders, or their guilds? How do those in power react to their privileges being stripped away? Do they resist violently, politically, subtly? What new opportunities arise for the common citizens or the marginalized groups of society as a result of the reforms? How does the removal of old elites create new power struggles or alliances within your societies? And how do the reforms impact the cultural and social norms of your world? Does it lead to more equality or just to a new hierarchy? When you're world building these radical reforms into your societies or your histories of your world, think about both short-term chaos and long-term benefits. Your world or certain regions of your world might experience upheaval following radical reforms. Think wars, economic disruption, society turning against itself. But the long-term outcome could be positive if the reforms align with broader economic opportunities, like, for example, with the French Revolution and the onset of industrialization. So in your world building, think what immediate crises are going to arise from societies implementing reforms or revolutionaries implementing reforms in your world? Will you have war? Will you have economic collapse? Will you have revolts? How do the leaders justify the reforms despite the initial turmoil? Do they offer promises or visions of the future? How do different factions, think nobles, merchants, farmers, the religious, how do they react to the changes? Who endures the hardship and who capitalizes on it? What new opportunities or technologies arise during the chaotic period? How do those influence the post crisis society? And after this chaos subsides, what new order or structure will emerge in your society? Is it better than the old one, or does it just lead to new problems? You also need to think about the persistence of reforms. So, even after Napoleon's defeat, many of the institutional changes introduced by the French persisted, particularly in regions where old elites didn't return, like the Rhineland. In your world building, reforms might outlast the regime that implemented them, especially if they benefit key sectors like business or industry. So think, how do the reforms in your world persist even after those reformers are gone? What makes them hard to undo? Are there factions or regions that try to revert to the old ways? How do they do it? Why do they fail? Why do they succeed? Are there unexpected positive or negative consequences that emerge as a result of the reforms that outlast their creators? And how do those new generations coming up after the revolution, after the reform, how do they view the reforms? Are those seen as the foundation of progress or just a lingering curse for society to deal with? Are there parts of society that fight to preserve the reforms after the generation that implemented them are long gone? Why? Is it the middle class, the military, another group? Who are those backbones of society that preserve those reforms long into the future? The reforms of the French Revolution had a huge impact across Europe, including the abolition of serfdom in places, the weakening of guilds, the introduction of commercial courts, especially in places like the Rhineland and northern Italy. The spread of these radical reforms across regions through conquest, occupation, through assimilation of the ideas can lead to widespread changes. In your world building, one powerful state could impose transformative laws that could affect other regions and reshape political and economic landscapes. So think, how does one state or empire in your world spread its reforms to neighboring regions? Is it through conquest, diplomacy, trade? How do other nations or regions react to the imposition of foreign reforms? If a monarchy is seeing this revolution from afar, do they adapt? Do they resist? Do they negotiate? What cultural, political, or economic clashes arise when foreign reforms meet local traditions? How do reforms spread organically between and within regions, beyond just official mandates that come from the government? Does it come through travelers, through merchants? Do scholars play a role? And what long-term effects do these reforms have on political balances of power between nations in your world? While one aim of the French Revolution was to create a more equal society, the reformers were met with resistance from various groups who felt their livelihoods, traditions, and status were under threat, like nobles, the church, some rural areas, and even there were internal divisions among revolutionaries trying to figure out how far to go with these reforms. This resistance was fueled by their social, religious, economic, and political factors, and contributed to the violence of the revolution over time. So, in your own world building, recognize that reforms are not welcomed by everyone. Conflict over new laws or resistance from elites can create political drama in your world, and this struggle between reformists and traditionalists can be a central theme in a story and in shaping your world's history. Think, what factions or groups resist the reforms in your world? Why? Are they fighting for tradition, power? Are they fighting for survival? How do reformers deal with resistance? Are they brutal? Are they diplomatic? Do they manipulate or win over their opponents? How do the reforms impact the relationships between different races, religions, or cultures in your world? What kind of political drama or intrigue unfolds as new power structures emerge? Are alliances shifting? Are betrayals more common during that time? And how does this resistance shape the narrative of your world? Do you have rebellions, or is it just slow progress creating this enduring tension in your story? You also need to think about the broader effect on institutional change. What institutions in your world are designed to promote growth? Are there legal, educational, or economic systems? Who builds them? How do these institutions balance power between different social classes, regions, or factions? And what happens when those institutions are corrupted or they fail to function properly? Who suffers? Who benefits from this breakdown? How do those institutions evolve over time? How do they adapt to new challenges? How do they resist change? And when you have these radical reforms, how do they shape and reshape these institutions over time? And what internal struggles do you have within those institutions against the radical reforms? Finally, how do the reforms, these radical reforms of society and culture, how do they shape the day-to-day lives of ordinary people in your world? What new freedoms or limitations do they experience, and how does that affect your story going forward?